Hey everybody, this is Mike Hamrick over at Wilwood Disc Brakes. We're here today at Eddie Motorsports putting together and helping them get their SEMA project done. It's a 1972 Nova, and it's a car that a lot of people aren't building right now, so we wanted to go ahead and help out with it. We've got all of the Heidts suspension on the front end. You can see that this is a Pro G front end from Heidts. It's got their Pro G spindle, which is pretty much what you're gonna find in a lot of front ends like this. This is gonna be an AFX-based spindle. So we have lots of brake kits that fit that. And the nice thing about this front end is we're going from the old steering box that's mounted to the back of the engine to a conventional rack and pinion that's in the front. So we're gonna get started on putting together some of the parts to put the 13-inch Superlight brake kit on this car, and follow along as I'm going through and doing a lot of the specs on it. So we already assembled the other side of the car. We did the driver's side, so we already know what shims we want to use on this side. And because this is an aftermarket spindle, unlike a lot of the stock spindles that were machined with small tolerance differences, this one should all go together pretty much the same as the first side. So we've got the same amount of shims. We're going to shim the secondary caliper bracket the same amount, and that should ensure us getting the caliper centered over the rotor the first time. All right, so we're going to install the hub now. We've got the bearings packed, the seals in place. We're going to get it on here, feel it really nice and easy, and then confirm that we've got the seal up against the gland where it rides. Once we've got that on there, take our outer bearing that's been packed. Now here's something that a lot of people end up messing up or doing wrong with our Wilwood product. If you can see, we send it with one of our spindle washers. And if you looked at the factory spindle washer, it's a larger diameter. What happens when you use the factory spindle washer, it won't fit down inside of our cap. And what it ends up doing is riding on this edge. So when you're doing a Wilwood brake kit and it's using a Wilwood hub, make sure you use our spindle washer, and it'll also put that nut right where it needs to be. Now, a misconception. A lot of people think that there's going to be a torque spec for this. But because the bearings are conical, there's no torque spec. It's just like any car that you've worked on in the past that has its hub with conical bearings. You need to tighten it and move the hub around. And you can see, as I'm turning this hub, I'm still getting a little bit more turn on the nut. Now we want it to be snug and tight, but not too tight. So what I'm finding is at this point, I think we're a little too tight. So I'm gonna back it off just a tick so that we've got a good spinning, but it's not dragging too bad. Then once we put in our cotter pin, it's gonna hold that nut in place. So a nice little thing about our Wilwood brake kits that use our forged aluminum hubs, most of them, we've got these nice 1/4-20 set screws that center register the hat rotor assembly onto the hub. Something that we always want to make sure of is that we're either hub-centric or lug-centric, but we can't be hub-centric with our aluminum hubs on the center register. So by having it centric to these 3 set screws, we know that we're not going to have any run out with it. Now, like I do every time I add another part to the brake kit, what I do is I make sure that everything is free spinning and that we've got no interference with anything. So a great example is on this 13-inch rotor, the bracket assembly is pretty close to the inside edge of the rotor, but it's been designed so that we have enough clearance so that there's no interference. We're ready to mount the Superlight forged narrow caliper onto the assembly. Now, you might think that we're kind of doing this and everything's fitting great, but what we'd already learned is from assembling the other side, we should be using the same amount of shim washers to get everything centered and on its radial height as the other side. So if we're right, everything's gonna fit together perfect. We've got the brake pads already installed inside the caliper. We've got the correct height on the caliper. We still have good movement of the rotor. Everything is very centered up. So what I want to do is get the radial mount nuts onto the bracket and tighten it up. Now we're going to do it hand tight, and once we know that everything is good and centered, then we're going to torque it down. So we've got the radial mount nuts, tighten the caliper down. We've probably got about 15, 20 foot-pounds of torque on them right now. We need to go up to 30. But as you can see, we still have great movement and no dragging between the rotor and the brake pads. We've already centered up this caliper to within a half a shim left to right. So we know that we're down to about 10, 15 thousandths being perfectly centered. And that's what's going to come with the kit, everything to get you as centered as possible. So whenever we come across a project, what we try to do is work with the customer and build the system that's going to work properly for what they expect the car to do. Is it going to be a street car that you drive spirited on the road and maybe do some autocrosses, but are you thinking about going to an open track? And the answer was no open track, but most likely some autocrossing. Because our parameters are at an 18-inch wheel, we knew that we could go up to a 14-inch brake. But because of the amount of driving and the style of driving they're going to be using the car for, we really chose the 13-inch or 12.8 Superlight kit for this front end and the rear end. We did that for a few reasons. We've got enough mass in the rotor for any spirited street driving and for some autocross. Along with this, you're going to be looking at the tandem 7/8 master cylinder, which is going to be working off of a manual setup off of the stock brake pedal. We know that with the stock brake pedal leverage, these brakes, we're going to be building more than enough pressure to the brake system front and rear and have enough volume so it's going to give a nice pedal feel. So I think that we're just about ready to get this thing mocked up and into the car. Then we'll start on the rear end. Okay, we're going to start assembling the rear end housing and getting all the brakes into it. So what we decided to go with the rear was matching in the front. It's going to be a Superlight, but a 4-piston. The front's a 6, the rear's going to be a 4, but it's the same housing, so the calipers match front and rear. Same diameter rotor as well. The rear is going to have our internal drum parking brake assembly. So just like a lot of modern vehicles, inside the rotor hat assembly, that's where our parking brake's going to lie. So I'm going to start bolting everything together. Came with the nice bolts from Curry. So we've got the bolts to hold everything together. And one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is when you're installing a Wilwood disc brake kit, use the Wilwood bearing retainer that comes with the kit. It has a slight offset, which is what we need in order to retain that bearing into the housing. So what we want to start with is getting our T-bolts into the axle flange housing, then slide the Wilwood bracket onto those 4. So now we've got the parking brake assembly in place. The next thing we need to do is actually install the axle. So now we're going to take the Wilwood bearing retainer and it's going to come from underneath. Okay, so everything's loose and it looks kind of like a mess. But what we're going to do is, here's our pilot hole. So we're going to turn the axle to where all 4 of the bolts are and get our nuts started. With a lot of aftermarket axles, and then companies like Heidts using a Curry axle aftermarket into what is kind of funny is into a Chevy product, right? Everybody makes different registers for the rotor assembly and for the wheels. So a lot of aftermarket companies go with a smaller register so that you have ability to use different brake kits. What we've done is we'll ask the customer questions like, who axles are you using? And then we'll send the brake kit with a specified center register ring. So that ring will go on first, and it's a nice, snug, tight fit. So what's going to happen is when I put the hat rotor assembly on here, it'll register to the center register of the axle and to the 1/2-inch wheel studs. So what we're going to do is we're going to mock up the caliper bracket onto the primary bracket. So I call the primary bracket on these kits the parking brake bracket. Then the secondary bracket or the caliper bracket bolts to it. Something that you've got to do is, on these kits, mock everything up first. make sure that everything's centered. Then keep a track of what washers or spacers and where you put them to make sure that that caliper's centered. So that's what I'm gonna be doing right now. And I wanna also show something else. Always read the directions. So on this particular kit, if we put a shorter bolt, 5/16 24 bolt, it wouldn't have enough thread engagement into the parking brake bracket. So we go with a little bit longer bolt, but we use 3 hardened washers to take up the length of the thread so that the thread doesn't push on the parking brake drum shoes. So what I'm in the middle of doing is getting my radial height where I want it. So that means the caliper over the rotor. And we want the pads to be even or just a little bit above the diameter of the rotor. That way when the rotor gets hot, it expands, it'll grow to the brake pad. What I've done is, instead of relying on my eye, I take the small shims and I see how much of a gap there is on both faces of the rotor. And it's just about even on both sides. So that means that right now, without using any of these shims on this rear end housing with these Wilwood disc brakes, we're not gonna use any shims. The caliper is already centered over the rotor. Now that we've got the caliper centered, we got everything mocked up, I'm gonna go through and get everything Loctited and torqued. You saw that we had installed the brakes on the axle before we put the rear end in the car. I worked with the guys who are gonna plumb the car, and we've got our new billet clamps for the axle end housings. So it's got a nice billet clamp that fits a 3-inch diameter tube, and it holds our steel braided line up to our caliper. It's become a game changer in a lot of different places, even with our race guys using these clamps. And when I showed these guys this new product, they were out of their mind about it. So I'm going through making sure everything's set up so that when they start plumbing the car with all the hard lines, they'll be ready to go. We've gotten to the point where everything from Wilwood has been installed on the car. What we're gonna do is come back in about a month or so after they get all the hard lines plumbed on the car and help the guys at Eddie Motorsports bleed the brakes, make sure everything's working properly so that it's ready to debut at SEMA this year. We really want to thank all the guys over at All Chevy Performance and In the Garage Media. Super happy that you guys include us. And if you guys have any questions about brakes or general discussions about brakes, please contact us over at Wilwood. The number is 805-388-1188, and it's wilwood.com.